Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally back with some LPL content, and it's the end of the regular season. Lunar New Year is over, it's done and dusted, we are past the big break, we are coming back with our final best of fives of the regular season, and by the end of this video, we are going to know the top two teams in Group A, B, C, and D that will be moving on to the 8-team playoff. We will, of course, be previewing the playoff at the end of this, but it's just exciting to finally get back into some LPL content. It's been quite a while, like I said, since we covered it, a couple of weeks since we've talked about anything from the LPL, and so definitely exciting to get back into it. If you're looking at the title and are a little bit confused, I don't blame you. You could be looking and seeing weeks 4 and 5. Well, the last video you posted was on week 2. What happened? Where is week 3? The best way I can describe this is that they ended up changing the schedule midway through the year. They ended up just moving one series, the first series of the year, to be quote-unquote week 1. That means all of week 1 is now week 2, and all of week 2 is now week 3. It's a very weird set of circumstances, but in today's video, we're going to be covering everything that we have not yet covered on the channel. So that's the 2 series that are technically a part of week number 4, and then, of course, every series that is a part of week number 5 to wrap up the regular season. So I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from this week? Did the teams that you expected to do well end up qualifying for the playoffs, or are you surprised by some of the outcomes? I'm definitely going to spoil it a bit now. I'm pretty shocked by how things have gone in the LPL. It certainly has not gone to expectation for me, and there are a lot of things that I think, there are a lot of takeaways, we'll just say, from how the LPL has gone over this final week. So I'm excited to get into it. I hope you are as well. Let's get into it. Let's not waste too much time. If you're new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And of course, at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said, this is the last week of the quote-unquote regular season, this group stage to qualify for the playoffs. You just have to get top 2 in your group of 4 teams, which likely means that you just have to get 2 series wins. And as long as you're able to do that, you are probably going to be moving on. Of course, it could theoretically be more complicated than that in some circumstances, and some groups are already locked in, but at the end of this video, we will be previewing the playoff bracket, kind of talking about what my expectations are and who I think has an advantage in that front. But without further ado, let's get into the actual series themselves. We've got 8 best of 5s to cover today, so quite a lot to talk about. We will be going series by series, and that means kicking it off with a Group D matchup. Group D is the one that's kind of lagging behind in terms of the games that have been played up until this point. There are a couple of groups that are determined. Group D is still wide open, and that opens up with our first series here, FunPlus Phoenix taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. And pretty predictably, Ninjas in Pyjamas is going to be able to pick up the victory here, and it's going to be a 3-0. It's going to be a sweep. They're going to dominate the beginning part of this week, and that's kind of what you wanted to see from them. They already came out and won the biggest series in this group by beating Invictus Gaming. That was the one they really needed to come out and win. That's probably going to determine whether or not they get first or second in this group. They're pretty big favorites against everybody else, and they followed up that victory with a gigantic break and then coming back and looking really good here as well. FunPlus does make the substitution that I was really hoping that they were going to make. Sorrow is out and Shadow is in. I think Shadow is definitely the better jungler. I think he's kind of been given a bad rep over the course of his LPL tenure, but this was not really a great example of that point. Ninjas in Pyjamas was just clicking basically on every level, and it does feel like they are really synergistic, which I think is really exciting for people who are fans of this org and of these players in particular. A lot of people are going to want to give player of the series to Doenby in the mid lane. I want to make it very clear he was exceptionally good in game number 2 on the rise, and I think if this was just talking about the single best game of the series, it probably was his rise game in game 2. He single-handedly won it with that ultimate in the back half, but even outside of that, he was just really good on that champion. He's obviously always been very good on rise, and you know, Care is not like the worst player in the world on the other side of this matchup, and so for him to be as good as he was, I can definitely see the argument that Doenby should be player of the series, but for me, it pretty obviously needed to go to Aki for the series as a whole. His game 3 on the Zyra was exceptionally good, and he still was very active in game 2 on the Nocturne. He makes that game a lot easier for the rest of the team, and Aki stepping up and just feeling a lot more like, you know, the 2023 version of Aki rather than the 2024 version of Aki, I think is going to matter a ton The best way I can say it is it does feel like he's practiced a lot of the champions and styles that he was so bad at last year. One of the reasons I think he had a down year in 2024 compared to his big breakout in 2023, where he was like a top 3 or 4 jungler in the LPL, is mostly because he just couldn't play AP junglers at a high level. He really struggled on things like Zyra and Brand and wasn't really able to adapt to a meta where that was just kind of commonplace and got replaced because of it. Leon was much better in those circumstances, and that's why I think Leon looks so much better down the stretch for this team in summer, but Aki is clearly worked on that a lot. The Zyra game was exceptionally good in Game 3. I think playing with Doenby and PP God in particular just kind of helps you in that regard because those two players are just so consistent, but give a lot of credit to Aki, who has just kind of improved, I think, on his biggest weaknesses. Now, the Nocturne, the Viego, these are champions that he has always been particularly good at, and if you just want to stay comfortable, just start picking those things again. Don't feel like you have to be a meta slave. Like, AP junglers aren't so broken like they were last year that you have to invest into them. I think there are definitely other options, even in a fearless draft setting. I think Aki definitely proved that in the first couple of games, and so I just want to give him a ton of credit. People have been very critical of him, and I think rightfully so, right? He came over to NIP with expectations and just, quite frankly, did not live up to that. Both of the OMG players last year did not really live up to those expectations, but I think this was a really good bounce back. Doenby obviously was the other candidate here for player of the series, and honestly, like I said, if you wanted to give it to him specifically for that Rise game in game number 2, I totally understand. It was the best game of the series from anybody on NIP. I just think Aki was better across all 3 games, if that makes sense. Of course, PP God also deserves a major shout out here. This guy has completely reinvigorated the macro and the mental of a lot of the players on this team. Doenby is definitely like a factor for that as well, just because he is so macro-oriented, but Aki being able to turn things around so succinctly, Leave not necessarily being as volatile, although he still is pretty volatile in comparison to what he was last year. Like, these are things that, you know, PP God just has a track record of improving the consistency in these areas, and he once again has done it on Ninjas in Pyjamas. Year 2 is always more of a question mark on any given org, but year 1, every time he goes to a different organization, it's always just such an immediate improvement for them, and we're seeing that once again. So Aki, Doenby, PP God, definitely the standouts, but for FPX on the other side, this team is just not particularly good. There's a reason I dropped them to bottom 3 in terms of my power rankings. I just don't think they have the talent to be able to hang in there right now, as much as I do like, you know, some of the players in their core. I think Sheer is obviously someone who showed a lot last year in a pretty high pressure situation on JD Gaming. You don't really know how that's going to translate to a lower tier team, but so far he's been fine, and I think Jway theoretically could be a good support, but you just don't really have the consistency anywhere. You don't really have a veteran presence that's going to come in and just kind of stabilize this team, and I think that's why they are kind of collapsing at the current moment. Shadow, I think, was kind of the hope, like that's what he was going to be, but he just got completely out-jungled by Aki in this series. He's going to get dud of the series. You know, it wasn't just him. Like, you could point to quite a few members of this team. I think everybody lost. Everybody was outclassed, maybe with the exception of Sheer, who just was kind of along for the ride, but Shadow, to me, the most notable. The Sejuani was completely useless in game number 1, and I think you can definitely point to that game number 3 on the Karthus just not really being as relevant as Aki on the other side, and say that that was his fault. He's supposed to be able to come in and upgrade this team. That didn't necessarily happen. He was not very good in this first series. I think Bat was like underratedly horrible here. People are going to remember that Varus game in game 3 where he was probably the most relevant player on FPX's side because Leave was just not playing Sivir well. Leave is not a very good Sivir, and so Bat actually was able to get some positives in that bot lane 2v2, but game 1 and 2, like games 1 and 2 were just horrendously bad from him. He does not look like an LPL caliber player. So far at the start of this year, he looks like one of, if not the worst AD carry in the entire region. Taiyun obviously is going to be taking that crown until further notice, but Bat is very much in that conversation. Jway doesn't really seem to be able to carry a lot of that momentum from last year over. Care got completely outplayed by Doenby, especially when it came to the macro sense of the game. FPX just was not on the level of Ninjas in Pyjamas. Not that we were really expecting them to be, but it's definitely frustrating to see how bad it really ended up going. So, you know, we'll see. This team probably is either going to go winless or they're, you know, just barely going to squeak by with one series win. They're not a particularly strong contender, and I think they're kind of proving that right now. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas, like, this is a really good team. 2-0 is indicative of how good they are. A 3-0 sweep here is very, very encouraging, and I think the most encouraging signs are just players like Aki, and we talked about Shanji in that first series, just playing so much better than they did at the end of last year and just generally throughout all of 2024. If Leave can, you know, I guess tighten up a little bit, you know, have games that aren't like game number 3 here on the Sivir, I think NIP is super well-rounded outside of that, and I think there are a lot of reasons to consider them, you know, maybe a potential top 4, top 5 team right now in the LPL. But then moving on to our second series, and I guess technically our final series of week number 4, it was a very pivotal matchup, a number 1 seed determining matchup between Weibo Gaming and JD Gaming in Group B. And JDG is going to pick up the 5-game set. This goes all the distance, and JDG is going to be able to pick up the win. This is a huge win for them. I know people were a little bit more concerned, we'll just say, about JD Gaming coming out of Demacia Cup because they did lose to Thunder Talk, and I think there was some like, are they actually the team we think they're going to be? Bringing in someone like Shun, who can be pretty hit or miss. Missing's not exactly coming off the best year of his career. Pays is replacing Ruler, and you don't know how that's going to work outside of Gen G. Scout isn't always the most consistent. Like, there were concerns about whether or not this team was going to live up to the price tag and the name power that they have, the star power that they have on this team. They have absolutely lived up to it. Weibo Gaming has honestly looked great so far at the start of this year, and they played really well in this series. Tion in particular was an absolute menace, was incredibly dangerous. Regular season Tion was very much in effect here, but JD Gaming was just more consistent across the board, and they had a better draft in game number 5, which allowed them to kind of get themselves over the hump. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Pays is going to get player of the series for me, although, like I've said in basically all 3 of their series up until this point, whether you want to give player of the series to Scout or Pays, I think is really up to personal interpretation. Whoever you think was a little bit more important to the series as a whole. Scout, I think, was maybe a little bit more relevant across the entire series, if you really want to go that route, and I know that's kind of the excuse I just used to give Aki player of the series in the previous one, but I think the difference, in my opinion, in this series is that Game 5 was so up in the air. It was very much in flux. It wasn't like set in stone where everybody is playing super well and it's just kind of a stomp in the way that it was for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Like, if Pays didn't have that really good Ezreal game in game number 5, I don't know if they win this series, because Shun was trying his best on the Lilia to completely run it down in game number 5. He is that flippy hit or miss player that we unfortunately were not hoping to see on JD Gaming at the current moment. It just feels like for every great play, he has another, like, truly unbelievably bad play. Like, there's just no way to describe how things are going. It's very Leave-esque. I know we just talked about Leave, but like, it's just, you got to be able to clean up those mistakes. That being said, it's not like Shun was bad throughout the series. His Nidalee, his specific Nidalee in game number 2 was unbelievably good. He completely ran that game. It's just the Lilia in game number 5, and really the most important game in this series where he needed to step up and didn't, and Pays was the one to kind of bail him out, I would say, generally on the Ezreal. So credit to Pays. He's been everything we could have hoped he would be for this JD Gaming team. He's still performing like one of the best AD carries in the world. The mechanics are definitely still there. If there was any concern that he was getting facilitated too much by Gen G and his job was just so easy, and now he was going to a team where he had to do more heavy lifting and he wasn't going to be able to keep up with that, I think any concerns of that have been completely wiped away so far at the beginning of the year, because honestly, this team has not given him much. They have not really given him the tools he needs to take over, and yet he still is taking over a lot of these games and a lot of these series. So credit to Pays. His skills have very much translated here to the LPL into a high success rate. And then Scout is obviously also phenomenal. Like, these two wanted to play together all offseason long. They were kind of linked with a couple of different teams as a carry duo, first LNG and then obviously JD Gaming. Weibo Gaming was on the table as well for both of them at times in the offseason, but they chose JDG. They chose this organization, and JDG is very happy for that, because these two have been actively carrying them across the finish line. I'm not saying, players like Ala and Missing have been horrible. Shun has definitely not been all horrible. He's made some incredibly great plays with his ridiculous mechanics. He's just not been consistent, but this team is not sitting at 3-0. Specifically, they're not beating Weibo Gaming if they don't have Scout and Pays, who might be one of the best carry duos in the entire world at the moment. But that's really the question, right? Can this team win without those two? We don't really know. We'll have to kind of see that into the future. At least for now, it looked good. And then for Weibo on the other side, like, you're going to be a bit frustrated that you lost this. I think a slightly better draft in game number 5 probably gets you across the finish line. I'm not going to say you were entirely susceptible to the worst draft in the world or something like that. This was a winnable game, but Elite Support kind of coming back to bite you once again. Not just Weibo, but basically everybody in the world has not looked particularly good on Elite Support at the pro level. Again, I want to reiterate my thoughts on this champion. You really do have to be so much better than the team that you're playing into. We've seen players like Delight look really good on it in the LCK, because Delight's playing it against bottom tier teams on the other side of the group matchups. Like, he's not playing it against the best teams in the world, and when he does, it doesn't work. It doesn't look nearly as good when you're able to snowball the game out of control just through a raw mechanical advantage. And you know, use your pressure to get like a 2 or a 3k gold lead at 10 minutes and just snowball the game out of control. That's what you want to do on elite support, because if it doesn't happen, that champion is literally nothing after like 12 minutes into the game. Like, it is a 0. There is nothing you can possibly do other than be like the biggest hindrance to your team that you could possibly have. And just because of that, Hong is going to get done of the series. And I hate doing that because I honestly think Hong was pretty good throughout most of this series. Him and Tion had great chemistry linking up in their wins, specifically game number 3, and moving around the map and being a huge nuisance for JD Gaming. Hong actually was very relevant in a lot of their wins, but he was so detrimental on the Elise, almost not like to his own fault, but like just to the fault of the champion, that I kind of have to give him dead of the series, because if he wasn't on Elise in game number 5, I think they probably win game number 5 just off of all of the mistakes that Shun was making. So definitely a bit frustrating in that regard. If you're looking for a positive, a player who played really well, Tion was the carry for Weibo Gaming in this series. He has been exceptionally good since he came over at the start of the year. I obviously think we expected this. We saw this coming. Not only is regular season Tion a thing, but Tion in general is just a really good player. He has not really underperformed at a major level since, I would say, 2022. Outside of that, he's just been really good and honestly been a bit underrated by international fans because he's kind of gained this reputation of being a high-pressure choker. Kind of crazy for somebody who's won a World Finals MVP to be able to get that reputation, but here we are. Tion was exceptionally good, probably better than Shun across this whole series. Xiaohu, Light, Breathe, they were fine. Breathe in particular, I think, actually did some interesting things, even if the scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but they just kind of got in their own way, and unfortunately that means when it comes down to like a game of inches, which this series essentially was, Weibo Gaming just isn't able to come out on top. I think this is a very winnable series for Weibo. I'm certainly not sitting here saying that Weibo can't be a top 3, 2 team in the LPL. I just think JDG came out and kind of proved that they are. They are, in my opinion, right now the second best team in the LPL. We'll see how that ages moving forward. I think that there is a world in which this team is so volatile and so reliant on their 2-star players that maybe they're not going to be the most consistent in these like playoff best of 5s, but from what we've seen so far, there's not really a lot of reason to be anything other than excited about them. But then moving on now to our third series of the video, and technically our first series of week number 5, the final week. It's Anyone's Legend taking on Team WE, and again, pretty predictably, AL is going to pick up a pretty dominant victory, even though this is a 3-1 series. Like, WE was able to take game number 3 and, pick up a win, which they've very rarely been able to do so far at the start of this year. That was mostly AL's incompetence rather than WE doing anything particularly exceptional. They basically handed WE a free win in game number 3 and then just went back to business in game number 4. Very weird draft from them, and obviously just some bad plays overall, but you can tell that AL wasn't taking this series particularly seriously, and that was reflective, I think, in terms of the outcome. Even though they weren't trying all that hard, and even though Shanks was kind of running it in game 3 and clearly just kind of mentally taking a series off, they still absolutely decimated WE, and that just shows you where both of these teams are at right now. AL is one of the best teams in the LPL, a top 3 team at the current moment at bare minimum. If you wanted them top 2, I think that's pretty understandable, and WE is the worst team in the LPL, and honestly, I don't even think that's really all that debatable at the current moment, so let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is actually going to go to Flandre on the top side. I have been super impressed with Flandre so far in Winter Split. I think he has been infinitely better than he was last year on JD Gaming when he was splitting time with Sheer. I think the expectation for him coming into JDG was just very strange. Like, he was brought in, I think, with the understanding and expectation that he was essentially going to be playing less games on stage than Sheer, and yet still needing to show up for their big playoff moments. At least that's what it appeared like to me, because Sheer was better in the regular season, and yet Flandre still got all of the best of 5 opportunities in the playoffs, and so I imagine it was always the plan just to have Flandre play these big moments and to try to get Sheer into a position where he could grow with the organization and play for them essentially moving forward. That's obviously not what ended up happening, but whatever the case, Flandre having a full-time starting job and actually being able to probably practice regularly with the team, clearly he's still got it. Like, clearly this guy is still someone that can dominate a lot of really good top laners. Not that Cube is one of them, but, he could dominate a lot of really good top laners if he got the chance and the opportunity. He was really excellent, especially on that Mbessa in game number 2. That was definitely his best game of the series, but the Jace game in game 1 was really excellent. The Camille was fine. Didn't really have to do all that much on the Camille, and everybody kind of ran it in game number 3, but he was the player that I think probably stood out the most to me in terms of consistency across this series, and I just generally wanted to give him a shout out because I do think he's been awesome and a big reason why this team has been so good, like a top 3 team to start this year. Obviously, the other two players I considered were Tarzan and Shanks. I really wanted to give it to Shanks because he was so good in their wins. The LeBlanc in Game 1 was genuinely unbelievable. The Galio in Game 4 was really good, but he just ran it so hard in Game number 3 on the Smolder that it did feel a little bit disingenuous. He was clearly not trying all that hard mentally. Like, he was not locked in. This was not a series that he took particularly seriously. He is kind of the one spearheading that narrative, and he does that sometimes, especially in the regular season. But overall, I would say that he was still excellent, and I think if you wanted to give him player of the series, I do totally understand. Tarzan was really good going into a jungler, and Monkey on the other side that was trying. Like, you can argue that he was not succeeding, that he was not necessarily doing well for WE, but he was attempting to make plays. He was super active and aggressive on the map as a whole, which I think is something to be encouraged, but Tarzan was definitely better, especially on the facilitators down the stretch of the series. The Sejuani in particular in Game 4 was very relevant. And Hope and Kale did a great job when they weren't playing Misfortune Elise and just hoping and praying that they snowball the game out of control. They were really good outside of that. So just generally speaking, AL looking like the more dominant team by a lot and it not looking particularly close. And then for WE on the other side, they just suck. Like, they make a change in the jungle here. Tianjin is out, Monkey is in. Tianjin was the only player I had any expectations for going into this year, so to see him be the one that ends up getting replaced for WE and Monkey come in to, like, try and fill some void, it's just laughable. Again, I don't know if it's just because Monkey and Vampire maybe have good synergy and, you know, want to play together. I don't really know. I think we have seen pretty consistently that pulling from that EDG youth team from last year, it's just not a particularly successful strategy in the LPL. Basically, everybody who's played for that team has turned out to not be particularly good at the LPL level, so I don't know, man. It's just a weird set of circumstances. Monkey came in and at least tried to be aggressive for this team, even if it did fail on multiple occasions, but he's not done of the series. That's going to go to Karis for me in the mid lane. I don't think Karis has even been all that bad for this team, all things considered. I think it's been a bit of a disaster everywhere across the map, but Karis has just kind of been there, I would say, for the most part. It's just so clear when you watch Karis go up against somebody who is actually good at mid lane and just see, like, the huge skill disparity that there is between someone like Shanks and someone like Karis, even when Shanks is not trying and not even really giving 100% effort. Clearly, like, Karis is still so outmatched and so outplayed in a lot of these circumstances that it's laughable. Like, the fact that you imported him is crazy. Taiyun and Vampire were, ironically enough, kind of okay here. Taiyun in particular was actually really good in Game 3 on the Ziggs, but again, how much of that was just, like, handed to him because of the draft for AL and because they weren't trying in Game 3? I don't really know. Cube didn't do anything, was kind of just there to take a bunch of damage from Flandre and then do nothing for the rest of the game. You know, Vampire I really don't think was good, especially in their losses. That Game 1 on the Leona was, like, actually horrendously bad from him. He was miserable there. Like, this is just a bad team. They're the worst team in the LPL, and I think that's become abundantly clear. This was their last series of the year. They're going to end, or of the split, not of the year, that would be crazy, of the split here, but they are going to end 0-3. You know, they're ending with 2 wins across the entire split. This team is just absolutely disastrous. There's really no positive takeaways to make from it. And then for AL, like, you weren't even trying and you slaughtered WE. This was just never supposed to be close. This was always supposed to be a cleanup series. After you've already gotten all of the hard ones out of the way, you're ending this group stage, winning Group A, which is a really great sign. It means you'll be in the winner's side of the playoff bracket, which is awesome. This team won Demacia Cup. They were able to carry a lot of that momentum over, and who's to say they can't keep this going? They've already looked so good in these best of fives against some really good teams. This could be a top 1 or top 2 team in the LPL, and maybe even a top 5 team in the world right now. Then moving on to our 4th series of the week, and it's a battle of winless teams up until this point that have very much underperformed. It's Edward Gaming taking on LNG Esports, and Edward Gaming is going to prove that even though they might not be great, they are not as bad as what LNG is at the current moment. They are going to pick up the 3-0 sweep in this best of 5, and they are going to end off their group stage at 1-2. There's a lot to talk about coming off of this series. I think, you know, we'll talk about it later on in the week. Group C ended up being a lot more determined before any games were even played than I had anticipated. I thought that second spot was going to be pretty wide open. Of course, Thunder Talk has turned out to actually just be a really good team, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on in the week, of course, but Edward Gaming and LNG have both looked a lot worse than you could have ever anticipated against those two other teams. It was really going to be this showing that showed whether or not it was just Group C actually being really good or these teams actually being bad. I think there are some things to be excited about for EDG. I'm still going to kind of temper some excitement on the org and on the team in general, but LNG is a disaster. This is actually one of the worst teams in the LPL at the current moment. They look completely inept, and I'm not even really sure that they are going to be a team that I put, like, outside of my bottom 5. Like, that's where they are at right now. 0-3, I think, is indicative of where this team is at, and we'll get into the specifics. This is going to be my Reddit rant of the video. I don't know if it'll be the only one yet, but in case you're one of those people that really hates when I do the rants on the Reddit opinions, then skip this section, I guess. But we'll talk about Edward Gaming first and foremost. Player of the series is pretty obviously going to go to Angel in the mid lane. Angel's an awesome player, but he's clearly not, like, fully invested in playing pro right now. Obviously, he's become a pretty successful streamer in China, and so I don't know how committed he is at the current moment towards playing pro. Even that was enough to get him across LNG to completely obliterate this team, because games 1 and 2 were absolutely phenomenal from him. The Victor, the Akali, both of those games were incredibly strong, and just generally speaking, when he's on, when he's like able to carry games, and when the team kind of plays around him and puts him into good positions, he can still be one of the most dangerous mid laners in the entire region. We've seen what he can do with resources on teams like Ninjas and Pyjamas. He was kind of that for OMG at times last year. Obviously not nearly as consistent, but recent memory has actually been pretty favorable towards Angel as a whole, and he was a big reason why I actually was kind of excited about this team going into the split. But he was awesome here. Definitely carried the, I wouldn't say the entire series because that's disrespectful, I would say, to the rest of EDG, but definitely did a lot of the heavy lifting and was the main character for Edward Gaming in this series. I think the other player that I really want to shout out is ZDZ on the top side. He's been pretty awful to start this split. Like, certainly has been one of the worst top laners in the entire LPL. Finally had a good series, and it was against a really good top laner in Zika. Really not the series or the circumstance I expected him to show up in. Zika has felt kind of hard stuck on LNG. He's been the one player that I think has kind of lived up to expectations so far this year, and that did not translate to this series. I don't know if he is just like mentally checked out because this team is atrocious, but for ZDZ to come out and, you know, kind of reverse his fortunes here, have a really good game in game 3 in particular on the Mbessa, I think that's a really big positive for him. Hopefully the solo laners can keep that up, you know, going into the spring split. Obviously this series doesn't matter for winter because they've already been eliminated, but hopefully ZDZ can keep this form up because this was infinitely better than the first 2 series that he played against the actually good teams. Xiaohao was really good. He's always a player that ramps up the more games he plays throughout the year. I always laugh because teams seem to not really realize that this is like the summer king of the LPL. Xiaohao always kind of is fine. Like, he's good in winter and in spring, like the beginning of the year, you know, going before MSI. He's always been a good player, but he becomes a great player in summer split. He always has the best version of his year in summer, and so hopefully this is just the same trajectory. Hopefully this is him, you know, leveling up as the year goes along. He's not been phenomenal, but he's not really been a problem for this team either. Assume and Wink are fine. Like, Photic and Juo just completely gave away everything. This bot lane is completely unplayable for LNG, and so it's hard to evaluate Assume and Wink because they just didn't really have to do all that much in order to generate a lead in this series, but they were fine. I think generally the standouts for me were the top side of the map, specifically the solo laners, ZDZ and Angel. They played really well here, and EDG picked up a win that they probably should have gotten, regardless of whether or not we thought LNG was as bad as they actually are. And let's be completely frank, LNG is as bad as we think they are. Like, they are just not good on any level right now. This team is underperforming everywhere, and even if you are, like, giving some credence to, well, jungle mid could probably be okay in a different circumstance. Weiwei, this is probably his best series of the year, and this one was still not great. He still was definitely worse than Xiaohao on the other side. He has been bad. Haichao has certainly not lived up to the expectations and the general vibe that he set for himself last year on LGD. Zika obviously at his worst series, but it all comes back to this bot lane, which is just unplayable. And, you know, Photic is going to get done of the series, but this is going to be my Reddit rant of the video, where I just think that this was so obvious, like, from the beginning, not only for LNG in particular, but, like, everybody's talking about, oh, what happened to Photic? Like, what happened to this player that was on pace to be one of the best AD carries? You know, I'm not going to sit here and say that it was obvious to everyone in the same way that it was obvious to me in 2022 that he was overrated, right? I had been calling him overrated on the channel ever since, like, he was winning in 2022 on Victory 5 with Rookie and PP God. I talked about how he had the easiest job of any player in the world, and even then he was still making a lot of critical mistakes, but we're acting like the crash out didn't happen 2.5 years ago. It was like it's happening right now. Like, Photic all of a sudden has determined himself to be bad. He was awful in 2023. I've talked about this a lot. He was the worst graded player for me in the whole of the LPL in 2023. He was all right, I guess, in 2024, but the summer performance in particular was horrible, even if he was actually pretty good in spring. Comes over here and is bad in spring and winter, and once again, like, this guy hasn't been good in 2.5 years, even if you want to count that Victory 5 2025 year as a positive one. This guy has just not shown anything. I don't understand why we are talking about it as if 2025 or even like the end of 2024 is like the start of his crash out. This guy has not been good in years, and honestly, I think there's an argument to be made that he was never really all that good. And the comment that really got me when I was looking on the post-match thread on Reddit is like, yeah, he has the same crash out as Hwanfeng towards the last stage of his career. That is just gotta be a troll. Like, that has gotta be like an ignorant take, because if there is no way to compare those two players. There is just no universe in which you can look at the performance of Photic and say that he is like even remotely comparable to Hwanfeng, who was fine on RNG, on a disastrous RNG team last year, and was really good the last time he actually had a full-time starting job, like for a team that was trying in Thunder Talk. He was really good, like a top 6 or 7 AD carry in the LPL on that team, and then just kind of lost his opportunity because they wanted to go with 1xN for the future, which obviously is a fine decision. They clearly, saw the investment that they wanted to make into a young player, regardless of how good Hwanfeng was in the moment. But comparing Photic to Hwanfeng, like, I mean, come on, man. Like, we have to be losing the plot if that's where we're at, because Photic is not even half the player that Hwanfeng is. Like, it's not even a remotely fair comparison. So he continues to really suck. Zhuo's not really making things better, although I do kind of wonder how much of this is like Zhuo being dragged down by Photic, because I think Zhuo in other circumstances has looked okay, like in isolation, but Photic is like so miserable at every stage of the game that it just makes me wonder what he would look like with a different AD carry. We haven't really seen that as an opportunity. I'm not saying he would look good. I'm just kind of curious what that would look like. Haichao's scoreline definitely shows him to be better than what he actually was in this series. Definitely outplayed basically at every avenue by Angel. Zico, like I said, at his worst series. Like, LNG is just a disaster. There are so many things going wrong. You need a new bot lane. Like, I honestly think this team needs like a new makeover. I would really only keep the solo laners. I would switch out jungle, ADC, and support going into spring if it were me, like in control of this team, because I just don't think this is ever going to get better with this configuration. I think you're actually doomed, and this team did have real expectations. I don't know what the money situation is looking like, but that would be my personal suggestion. And then for EDG, at least you were able to pick up one win. Like, there is something positive to take away from this, even if it's not perfect, all things considered, but beating LNG is certainly not the biggest accomplishment in the world right now. Then moving on to series number 5, and yet again, another battle of winless teams. This time it is much, much more fun, though. It was Ultra Prime taking on OMG, and OMG is going to pick up the 3-2 series win. It goes all 5 games, and once again, this was a banger. This was a super fun series that felt like it really could go either way throughout all of these games. Super action-packed, super back and forth. OMG tried their absolute best to not win this series, but Starry was absolutely having none of that. He came out and put on an absolute clinic to carry this team across the finish line, to really be the one to step up and, kind of take over the games and take over the series. There's going to be a little bit of a conversation from me about just the general narrative around AD carries on this series, because I do think that there is a lot to talk about, but Ultra Prime tried their best. Honestly, they didn't really play all that bad in this series, considering what they have been up until this point. They've not been as good as OMG. They've been one of the weaker teams in the LPL, I would say, all things considered. Even if they have shown flashes, it's really just been Junhao that's been an absolute disaster for them in the jungle, and even then, he probably was the better jungler in this series. It just wasn't enough to be able to get over the finish line. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Starry. This can't possibly go to anybody else. There's really just not a lot of ways to talk about this, and I've kind of been criticized in the comment section before for my takes and my views on AD carries. I think generally speaking, specifically, revolving around players like Teddy, and just generally how I feel about the position in general and just kind of the role that it plays on a team. This is an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about an AD carry that understands that they are the win condition and starts to take over the game, is actively calling for resources, the team grouping around them and actively pushing forward. This is what you want to see out of an AD carry, regardless of what's happening on the rest of the map. The top side was actively attempting to lose this game for the team, but because Starry was so aggro and was pushing his advantages so much, was not necessarily waiting for a power spike or trying to set up 5v5s, was actively pushing for skirmishes, even on champions that wouldn't necessarily love to do that, like the Jinx in game number 4. Because that was the case, that's why OMG was able to win these games, and I think that is the difference to me between an AD carry that is taking the game into their hands and an AD carry that is letting the game be played by their teammates. This was not a series where Starry was letting his teammates teammates play the game, even though there was good setup from the rest of his teammates. He was forcing that setup to exist from his teammates. That's the best way I can possibly describe it, is like his teammates were either going to set him up or like he was just going to run in and die, right? There was no alternative. If the teammates weren't going to do the setup, then he was going to run the game away. I think that's honestly kind of how you have to play AD carry in the modern day, in the modern era, and obviously it ended up really working here because he could outplay a lot of the people on Ultra Prime. I got some criticism in my primer as well for my AD carry rankings because I had 1xn below Starry, and generally I had 1xn below a lot of AD carries, but I want this to be like clear. It wasn't that I hated 1xm, like I wasn't as high on him, and obviously that's not necessarily proven to be a good take, but like it's because I was really high on Starry. It's because I do think this guy is a special kind of talent who can really break through and be an upper echelon type of AD carry at this level. I really see that mechanical ceiling, and this was just another really good showcase of that. And so I hope that explanation makes some sense, because it's just really difficult to communicate that through anything other than like a conversation. It's really difficult to communicate my thoughts on what I think the AD carry role should be doing through anything that isn't just a video. I think go and watch games 4 and 5 of this series if you want to know what I think a good AD carry looks like. Like, this is a great example of that, even when the rest of the team is really not doing well. As for the rest of this team, they weren't doing well. Like, that's the best way I can say it. Linfeng was fine. I really have no problems with Linfeng. He seems like a completely league average type of mid laner at this level. I think he could be good, but he's certainly not exceptionally good, just good enough to be able to get over the lesser mid laners like Saber on the other side of this, but everybody else was running it. Moham had some problems in this series, was definitely a bit aggressive, even if most of them did end up paying off. Obviously, the setups for the back half of this series on Starry were great, but games 2 and 3 were really not very good from Moham. And then the top side of the map is maybe the worst in the entire league. It's certainly in the conversation. Both Harry and Hang are just not LPL caliber players. Hang is actually going to get my dud of the series on the winning side here because he tried his absolute best to not win this series for OMG. Harry was very much in that conversation for me as well. I think he also played really poorly. You know, I've never been a Harry fan. I've actually been a pretty big Harry hater on this channel over the course of the last year or so, and so it's not shocking for me to see him struggle this much. I was shocked to see him come back to this team at all because it felt like they could do better in a lot of different areas, even if they just promoted internally. But, you know, bringing Hang in, I think they were hoping to get some of that magic that he showed at the beginning of his tenure on WE back out of him. It's just not there anymore. The feast or famine has just turned into like full famine, even when the rest of the team is playing well. So credit to Starry. He actively carried this team across the finish line, and this is what you want to see from an AD carry, is him be able to come out and just be like, I'm the most mechanically talented and the most fed player in the game. I'm going to force these plays whether my teammates want them or not. And then Ultra Prime on the other side, like, it's just not, like, they're not a complete team. They have enough problems that it kind of holds them back from being able to overcome things. I will say they're a very fun team, and they do have a lot of mechanical skill. Like, there is something to build on here. I still think Jiang in the top lane is someone to keep an eye on. He was probably not very good in this series. There were moments, like, pluses and minuses. I think it was a very, you know, interesting performance, we'll just say, from him if you look at all 5 games as a whole. Some really good stuff, some really bad stuff. Junhao continues to kind of struggle, even though I do think he was the better jungler in this series. Like, he's just not an LPL caliber player. Hang is also not an LPL caliber player, which did make this series easier. But again, I'm not a big fan of Junhao. Rosie Love definitely kind of ran it on that Elise game in particular in game 4. That's what gave all the momentum back to OMG. I'm just so anti-Elise if you're not just like the GOAT that I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just so out on that champion. I think it's cooking way too hard. Like, I get that it's probably dominating scrims and it is really good in solo queue, and you can see, you know, the benefits of it if it does end up working, but the negatives do not outweigh the positives when you are not this kind of team that can just like instantly end a game from a 2K gold lead. If you're not that guy, if you're not that team, then don't play Elise. Like, it's just, it can't do anything. Wacko's a good player with good mechanics. It just, you know, Starry was better, and Saber I think is generally fine, but again, Linfeng was better on the other side of this matchup. Ultra Prime is like the definition of interesting team, probably won't get results this year. I don't think they're the worst team in the LPL. There are worse teams in the LPL, definitely worse players in the LPL than the starting 5 that they have here, but they're certainly not exceptional either. They're probably not going to get a lot of victories over the course of this year. They'll be better, I think, than the worst teams in the league, and not as good as the teams that are actually trying to win or have any semblance of good players like OMG did here with Starry and with Linfeng to a lesser extent. OMG definitely had some positives to take away from this, but I'm certainly not changing my entire opinion on the organization just because Starry had another really good performance. This feels a lot closer to what the expectation was, which is them being, you know, a bottom, you know, 6 or 7 team, but having some star power. And so we'll see if that can continue to grow, but this top side is inevitably going to hold them back. Then moving on to series number 6, and it's our first time that we are going to see a team for the second time in this weekly recap video. It's Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on RNG, and NIP is going to pick up yet another 3-0. They're going to move to 3-0 in the group stage here. They're going to win Group D by going undefeated, and they're going to go 6-0 on the week in terms of their game score. I get that they played the 2 weaker teams in the group. They got the Invictus series out of the way early on, but still, to be able to come out and just dominate both FPX and RNG in the way that they did, super impressive stuff. Everything that you could have possibly wanted to see out of Ninjas in Pyjamas has been shown to you. This is a top, 5 or 6 team right now in the LPL. I'm super excited to see where they go from here. I think the LPL is pretty deep from number 2 to number 7 or so, somewhere around that area. I think a lot of those teams are going to be competing for good spots, but at least for now, Ninjas in Pyjamas has proven that they deserve to be considered in the upper echelon along with the rest of these teams. For RNG on the other side, they have some things going for them in this series that I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about. We'll talk about their AD carry, who I actually think played really well in this series, but, the players that you're expecting to step up and be the veteran leaders and to kind of stabilize the team for them to be able to play around, they're just not playing well at the moment, and, I think it's clear that when they don't have priority and when they don't have advantages, this team is just not going to be able to do much, and even though they technically still were alive going into this series, if they had won it against Ninjas in Pyjamas, they probably move on to the next round, or at least they have a pretty good shot to move on to the next round. They were never favorites, and they were likely never going to be able to come out on top here. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to DoeNB for me. What a fantastic week for DoeNB just in general. He was already really excellent in that first series against FPX and very narrowly got player of the series there. Now, I honestly don't think you could give it to someone else. I know Leave was excellent for Ninjas in Pyjamas, but his job was, once again, just so much easier than a lot of the other AD carries in this particular circumstance that DoeNB, I think, deserves more of the credit for being the playmaker and the setup for this team. He is the driving force, and I don't know if I've ever seen a player adapt so cleanly to Fearless Draft as opposed to what DoeNB is doing here. He can play anything. He's got it's not a champion ocean, he's got a champion globe, in terms of what he can do. He can play anything in the entire game. I actually think he could pick up almost any champion and make it work in the mid lane and do it against actual LPL talent. Now, Tong Yuan's not exactly the strongest mid laner in the world. We've talked about that aplenty on this channel before, but DoeNB is just ridiculous. It's actually unfair to see what he's able to cook up in these drafts, and I think teams are going to have to get used to him being back in the league. It's very funny. His last tenure on LNG, when he was playing with Tarzan and that team, was kind of a disappointment, really left a sour taste in my mouth when it came to his pro performances, but he is clearly much more of the version of him that was, dominating the league and winning worlds on FPX many years ago. So happy to see that that is the version of DoeNB that has continued to stand the test of time. Leave and PP God were excellent here. Again, I don't want to disparage Leave. It's not like I'm trying to sit here and say that he did anything wrong. He just wasn't the main character, and to me, that's not player of the series. But he was excellent. And again, all Leave needs to do is exactly what he did in this series. He just needs to be the guy that can take the resources that this team is so adept at being able to generate in the current meta and use that to dominate games and really take over in the late game. He just needs to not make the major mistakes that he was last year, because he is a very mechanically talented player. He's a phenomenal team fighter, a really good mid-game skirmisher. He's got so many tools and so many traits that would lead you to believe that he could be one of the best AD carries in the world. He just has not been able to find the consistency because of his bad decision-making and his random ints throughout the game, and I think cleaning that up is just all he needs to do. Again, just a performance like this. If you do this, even with Jiachi on the other side playing well, that's a really big positive. PP God is obviously a huge reason for that, and I think him coming back to this team has been ginormous for them, not only linking up with Leave and, being able to play the macro game with DoeNB, but like I said, getting him back with the OMG players on the top side that really benefited from having him on OMG in the first place when that team made a miracle run a couple of years ago to go top 4. That's exactly what you want to see. This team is just clicking on all cylinders. The best case scenario is currently happening for Ninjas in Pyjamas, and that could make them a very, very scary team going into playoffs. And then for RNG on the other side, they just have very clear flaws, and it's not even really the flaws that you would expect. First and foremost, Nickit is actually in here playing support over Lele. I think this was the intention all along. I don't really know what the reason was that they weren't able to make this happen early on into the split. This was rumored in the offseason that their starting support was going to be Nickit all along, but again, I don't know why he hasn't been playing. I don't know why he wasn't signed at the beginning of the split. Either way, he's coming in here, and I think this is, like, theoretically an upside move. Like, Nickett has shown some good things, I would say, at the LPL level before. Not consistency. Like, he was awesome at the beginning of summer and then just completely fell off at the end of summer last year, but at least he's shown the ability to play well, and I think this bot lane actually had some chemistry in this series. I'm excited to see where they go. Obviously not here in winter because this was their last series, but I'm excited to see what could happen moving forward. But unfortunately for RNG, the players that you brought in to kind of be the stabilizing presences, the players that were supposed to carry a lot of these games, they're just not playing particularly well. Milky Way has been not very good. I'm not going to say I'm shocked by that. I would have loved to see him, like, continue the trend that he was on last year, where he was on a pretty middling FPX team that really just had a bot lane and no solo laners to speak of. And, you know, he was able to step up and, you know, carry that team at times to top 6, which was super impressive from him. But also, he was playing, I think, against worse teams regularly, and all, you know, like, I think this team is worse than what he had on FPX last year, and now we're seeing the circumstance where Milky Way has to do everything, and he just doesn't have, like, the ability to do that out of the jungle. I'm not going to criticize him too heavily, but a lot of the flaws that we saw start to get exposed more at the end of summer from him, they're just getting exploited even more right now, so really not great. And then Xiaoshu on the top side just has been disappointing. I was really hoping he was going to have I don't want to say a breakout year here for RNG, because I think it was always going to be a pretty tough scenario and situation to do so, but I was really hoping that something was going to go right for him, and it's just not really happening. This team isn't the worst. Like, winning against FPX in the way that they did was fine, and they really did go toe-to-toe with Invictus. Like, this team has shown some interesting pieces. There was a reason I put them in my top 10 in terms of my expectations, but it's just mostly because the bottom echelon, we'll just say, of the LPL is a bit of a disaster. RNG is clearly leagues below the teams that are actually good, even if they do show some promise, and for NIP, they are a team that's actually good. This is a team that's going to be competing to maybe even win the LPL again. Like, everything is just so wide open at the current moment, it's so difficult to get a read on anything, but NIP is really good. Ninjas in Pyjamas is best case scenario for them right now, and I think that's a really exciting thing for a lot of LPL fans. But now we move on to our 7th series of the week and the biggest upset of the year so far. I think I can pretty confidently say that without really a lot of reservation. It was Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and somehow, some way, Thunder Talk Gaming is walking out of this series with a 3-2 best of 5 win over the defending LPL champions, the back-to-back LPL champions. This is the first time that BLG have lost a best of 5 domestically in the LPL since 2023. This is the first time that Knight has lost a domestic best of 5, I think, since spring of 2022. Like, it's actually been 3 years since Knight has lost a best of 5 in the LPL, and Thunder Talk Gaming just came out and beat them in a 5-game series to go 3-0, to go undefeated, to win Group C. This is genuinely the biggest upset of the year. This is one of the biggest results of the year so far, and I don't even really know how to take this. I don't really know how to react to this because it's just so unexpected. It's just so out there, and there really was no setup to consider this a possibility for this series. And you know, we'll talk about it. Like, Thunder Talk wins the first 2 series. They go up 2-0, but Bilibili fights back. They win Game 3. They win Game 4. Elk is having a phenomenal series on these hyper carries, on the Twitch, on the Jinx, and it really does feel like the momentum has completely swung back in favor of Bilibili, that they weren't taking it as seriously at the start here. They hadn't dropped a single game up until this point in the LPL, and yet, in Game 5, when it matters the most, it's not only a win for Thunder Talk, it's a demolition. 1 kill for Bilibili in the final game of this series. It's just ridiculous. And the players that are stepping up, like, some of them you could expect for Thunder Talk. 1xN has been a player that people have been talking about for a while, even if I've been lower on 1xN. Like, if you would have told me he would break out this year and really dominate, it's not out of the realm of possibility. But Hoya solo killing Bin, Satab being just as good, if not better, than Knight on the other side, and my player of the series, Bei Xuan, taking over. He's leading the entirety of the LPL in player of the game performances in winter here. People were saying that it was absurd that he even had a job last year, and I would agree at times. He was maybe the least valuable player in the spring split in 2024, and It's such a weird dichotomy, right? Because I was such a big Beishwan defender at the start of his career, like before last year, before 2024. Like, go look at my 2023 LPL reviews, even my end of 2022 LPL reviews. I was kind of the guy that was like, Beishwan is a really valuable player because he doesn't really make mistakes. He's a very smart player who has really good macro and is a good shot caller. He's just not particularly mechanically talented. Like, he just doesn't have like crazy hands. He's not this game breaker. He's not this hyper carry. It's not really his style. He's a really good facilitator jungler, and I thought he was valuable. I was the one to defend him in 2023 and so on, like 2022, that era. But then last year again, everything fell apart, and even like his defender was kind of giving up on him, saying like, maybe you do go in a different direction. It's maybe not Zhao Huangren like everybody wants this team to promote, but maybe you gotta find somebody else in the jungle. They did not. They stuck with him, and they come into this year, and he has just been spectacular, absolutely sensational for this team. He comes out in Gap's way in the jungle, like not just Beats way, completely Gap's way on the champions that Wei is best at. It's actually crazy to observe what has happened to Beishwan, and I'm honestly so here for it. This guy has worked so hard to be like a competent LPL jungler. For him to come out and genuinely be one of the most valuable players in the entire league right now, it's just crazy. Like, it's super fun to watch. So credit to Beishwan. Credit to Satab, who I thought had a really great series against Knight. The fact that Satab has come in, like him and Yucal basically switching spots, and everybody going, like, DRX committed highway robbery with that change with Yucal coming back, and obviously he's been phenomenal for DRX over in the LCK. He is, like, the piece for that team, but, it was like, Satab's coming over here, and he's, if Yucal was hard stuck on this team, Satab is going to drag them down into hell, but he's come over and been really good for them. He beat Knight in a best of 5 domestically. What is that about? 1xN was awesome in this series. Elk was really good on the other side of this. I'm not going to sit here and say that 1xN was like definitely better than Elk, because he was trying his best to 1v9 this series for a lot of time. Elk has a lot of experience doing that, as he showed on Ultra Prime in 2022. He knows how to win on bad teams, even when they're not playing well, but 1xN was just as good as Elk, and he had the team surrounding him like step up. That's what you want to see. Feather, I think, has been a phenomenal addition. Hoya solo killed Bin in this series. Like, what are we doing? This is like actually the craziest timeline. Like, there is no way I can justify or give any sort of rational analysis on what is happening here. Hoya was like the worst top laner in the league last year. This guy was unplayable in 2024, and he's coming out and solo killing Bin. Like, I genuinely just don't know what to tell you. I would say that it's BLG, like, not being super focused and locked in, but that excuse goes away once you start dominating games 3 and 4. Like, game 5, like, to get obliterated in the way that they did, to completely get outplayed, like, there's just no mental excuse for that. If they were like a best of 1 or even a best of 3, like, you lose the first 2 games, it's like whatever, like, they clearly weren't prepared or ready. But like game 5, losing that in the way that they did, it's just not acceptable, and it's such a positive to Thunder Talk. I don't even know how legit this team is. I don't even know what to take away from this series. We'll talk about that at the end, but is Thunder Talk really good? I can't tell you, because they shouldn't be. They have no reason to be really good, but yet here they are, beating the defending back-to-back champions and doing it in pretty dominant fashion. And then for BLG on the other side, like, even more so for them, what analysis could I possibly give them? This was a team that was undefeated going into this series, and yes, Group C is not exactly the most devastating group of all time. Edward Gaming and LNG have both proven that they're not exactly the toughest opponents in the world, but they were 6-0, they dominated both of those series, they looked exactly like we thought they were going to look. They looked like the best team in the LPL, and a team that could contend for being the best team in the world, and it all fell apart in this series, and I just don't really know what to take away from that. Jungle and support were awful. Wei and On were unplayable. On is going to get dud of the series. Wei absolutely deserves dud of the series. I think in almost any other circumstance, he would be getting it here over the support. It's just both of them played absolutely miserable, and it just goes back to a lot of the reports we heard in the offseason, where these two don't actually like playing with each other. On really wanted to play with Shun. That was a big reason why Shun came back at Worlds and actually played for that team at Worlds, was because On preferred playing with the more aggressive style of Shun and didn't really like playing with Wei, and Wei doesn't like how aggressive On is. He wants to play a lot more controlled. He wants to play a lot slower in terms of the style. That's what we saw when he came in for BLG at the beginning of their tenure, and it just feels like these two, like, it's kind of coming to a head right now, where it feels like, I don't know, maybe, do they have to make a decision on this, or are they just going to have to conflict in terms of playstyle all year long? Because that's immediately going to halt their upside. I'm not going to try and put, like, false narratives out there. If this isn't true, then it isn't true, but we've just heard so many reports about it that I kind of have to believe it's the case right now. And through all of this, you have players like Knight and bin, not beating their expected to be bottom of the position ranking counterparts on the other side of this matchup, and you have Elk just going, please God, anybody else on this team, do anything. Don't make me do 100% of the work. I can do that. I did it on Ultra Prime. It's the reason you guys picked me up in the first place, because you knew I could carry even if things were going wrong. But if you're going to play like this, it might not even be possible. My support and jungle are running it. My mid and top are losing against like Satab and Hoya, and despite the fact that I'm hard carrying these games, it just doesn't matter. So yeah, I feel bad for Elk in this situation because he played really well in this series, but like Bilibili has some real issues, and we'll see if they end up being like confirmed or anything like that, you know, just like anything that carries over into playoffs. They still are going in at 2-1, at 8-3 in terms of game score. That's significantly better than a lot of the other teams that will be going in as a number 2 seed from their own individual group, but this team's going in as a 2 seed. They didn't win their group. That's just unbelievable. And Thunder Talk did win their group. They went undefeated. They beat them here. They carried over that Demacia Cup form. Again, I don't know how to rate them. They're going to be like a weird one in the power rankings at the end of this week, and just generally to project going forward in the playoffs, because what is this team? I genuinely can't tell you, but at least where we are right now, whatever ride we are currently on at the start here of winter, I'm just really happy to see that it even exists in the first place. Then moving on to series number 8 of the week here. We're getting real close to the end, but not quite wrapped up just yet. We are wrapping up Group D, though, with this final series. It's Invictus Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and IG is going to pick up the 3-0. Not really a ton to talk about when it comes to this series. This just was playing towards expectation. You still get the traditional IG kind of screwing around for a bit in the middle of the game, because that's just what's going to happen when you put these 5 players on a team together. Even Mako can't corral the nature of the Shy plus Rookie. It's just, if he did, it would be a slight against what Invictus Gaming fans are hoping for, but this is a very talented team, and just because they weren't able to beat Ninjas and Pyjamas in a pretty close best of 5 doesn't mean that they are all of a sudden bad, and that, you know, them growing together over time is not still very much possible. FunPlus is just not a particularly good team. They're going to end this group stage winless, 0-3 in terms of series, but 1-9 in terms of games. They only picked up 1 game throughout the entirety of Group D here, and they're just not very good. Like, it's going to be a very similar conversation to what we had already earlier on in the week, but we'll get to that in a second. Starting with Invictus, player of the series to me is going to go to Gala in the AD carry role. I think it was either him or Jeje. I think it really should go to one of those 2 players, both of them. I think we're definitely the driving forces of IG and of their teams in this game. I think the Ziggs and the Ezreal, though, for games 2 and 3 really kind of pushed it over the top for me when it came to Gala. Getting it, the Ziggs in particular was fantastic in game number 2. He played Arcane Comet Ezreal in game number 3, which is like dark tech, like something that I just, I don't know if I can get super behind, but, you know, he was playing basically with a very interesting rune choice, and yet still was able to kind of dominate a lot of that game and just kind of be the better AD carry, really take over that bot lane matchup. Gala is obviously really great. He hasn't necessarily shown that so far, I would say, in 2025. It's been kind of a muted, I would say, start to the year for Gala, but he's still a player that I really value. I think he's super consistent as a weak side player, which is why I think he does work really well with the rest of this team, because Jeje wants resources, Rookie wants resources, the Shy obviously eventually is going to ask for resources, and so having a player like Gala on the team that can play a lower resource style, that can still be very relevant in that role, I think is a huge positive overall for IG. But it wasn't just him. This was a team effort. Jeje, like I said, was really excellent in the jungle, specifically on the Lee Sin in game number 3, where it really felt like he carried a lot of the action in this series. Shadow has not looked the way that I thought he would for FunPlus. I think part of that is probably the lack of scrim time that he's gotten with the team, but generally, like, the team is just bad. Shadow is going to struggle in a circumstance where the rest of the team is a bit of a disaster. We've seen that already in his career when he has to play for a team like LGD, but Jeje very much took advantage of that with the Lee Sin in particular in game 3. Nice to see him have a really good start to the year. I think he's been excellent for Invictus. I think he's probably been the best player on this team to start off 2025 so far, which is a really good sign. Hopefully he can keep that form up. Again, Rookie, Mako, the Shy, all of them were really good. All of them had their own inting moments throughout the rest of this series. Even Gala and Jeje weren't perfect throughout this series. There are going to be 5-6 minute stretches throughout series against especially bad teams that they know they can beat, where they're just going to kind of lose their minds a bit, because that's Invictus Gaming. That's these players. That's just kind of what they do. But For the most part, this is kind of the result and the outcome that you anticipated, them just being way better basically in all 3 games. And then for FPX, not really a lot to talk about here. Bot lane got obliterated. Jway is going to get my dud of the series, although I think you could pretty realistically give this to Bat as well in the AD carry role. It's pretty much got to go to one of those two because both of them basically completely ran it down this entire series. Gala outplayed both of them in pretty major ways, and unfortunately, we're just kind of seeing that this bot lane isn't particularly good. Jway has not carried the good form that he was able to generate at times in 2024 so far over to FPX, and Bat has looked very outmatched in basically every matchup that he has been in. This bot lane looks like it's going to be one of the weaker ones in the league, especially frustrating considering you kind of struck gold last year with Duckdom and Life as a import duo that came in and just played really well. That does not look like it's going to be the case this year for FPX's bot lane. Shadow continues to be a problem, already kind of stated that. I don't know what's going to happen in the jungle. Maybe you just play Sorrow. If Shadow's going to come in and not be a positive for this team, then like I would rather have the upside potentially of someone like Sorrow that has not been given a ton of chances at this level. But my thing with Shadow is just I assume he hasn't had as much time to play with the rest of this team, to scrim with the rest of this team, and maybe you give him a bit more time to settle in and be the starter for this team to kind of get to play all their scrim blocks and kind of get to see where that goes, and maybe things get better. Like, that's really the only outcome. But again, Shadow was not particularly good against 2 actually good junglers this week. Care is fine. He's been okay, I would say, to start this year, but certainly has not been exceptional and really didn't do much here. Sheer was actually okay in this series. Definitely took advantage of the mistakes that IG was making and actually kind of got a little bit fed in a couple of these games. But again, just not really much to do. FPX is a disaster. Their bot lane is horrible, and there's really not a lot of ways that I expect them to be able to turn it around. They're ending at 1-9, 0-3. This team is bad. They're one of the worst in the entire league. The only reason they're not bottom 1 is because there are some truly horrific teams in the league right now. But for Invictus on the other side, like, nice win. I still want to see this team be a bit more like dominant and consistent, but this is about as good as you're possibly going to get against FPX, at least in terms of how this team is constructed. They did bounce back nicely, and 2-1 is certainly not a bad finish considering their one loss is to Ninjas and Pyjamas, who does look like a really good team right now. They might even still be better than them. Again, I had them ranked above them in my power rankings, above NIP, because I thought that they would age better, especially once we start leaving the Fearless format. I think that might actually be a negative towards NIP and might be a positive towards teams like IG that are a little bit more confined and specific in terms of the styles of comps that they want to play. But overall, this is still a team that I expect to give them time and they will figure things out. They absolutely could still be a top 2, top 3 team in the LPL. We'll just have to see. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in our final series of the regular season in the LPL Winter Split. It's a pretty predictable outcome and a 3-0 sweep. It's LGD Gaming taking on Top Esports. And Top Esports, like I said, pretty predictably is going to be able to pick up the 3-0 win. I moved them down, obviously, in the power rankings after their loss to AL. AL jumping all the way up to number 3, TES falling to number 4 after being a top 2 team for me at the start of this year. They have issues. Like, there are problems on this team. They're certainly not perfect. There are a couple of players that I think definitely need to clean up some of the plays that they're making, but this is still a really good team, and I think generally speaking, people just have so much Top Esports fatigue, and almost all of it just comes from their international tournaments and generally from this perception and this vibe that this team never, quote-unquote, performs in the clutch or lives up to expectations or whatever, right? Like, everybody is inherently, like, half a tier lower on Top Esports than their roster would probably indicate that they should be, or that their gameplay would probably indicate that they should be. I think really the exception to that is a lot of the analysts who kind of recognize that these teams are really good and that it's not always their fault that they end up in these bad situations. It sometimes is, but this is still one of the best teams in the LPL, and this is still a team that absolutely could make a finals run. I think that is still very possible for Top Esports. For LGD, it is very clear what this team is at the moment. Maybe they're not the worst team in the league. I really felt like it was them and WE that were really at the bottom of the barrel in terms of expectations, but, you know, they show some interesting signs at being able to get resources. They just do absolutely nothing with those resources once they have them. It's kind of your prototypical young team, like good hands, you know, pretty decent at being able to go toe-to-toe with players in the early game, but just once that 12-minute mark hits and those skirmishes become a lot more intentional, they just don't really have the firepower to be able to keep up. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Jackie Love in the AD carry role. I think you could give this to Kanavi. He was definitely the other player that I really considered here. Both of them were excellent, but Jackie Love to me was probably the main carry, especially in that third game on the Varus. That poke Varus was exceptionally good. Jackie Love's always been excellent on Varus, and again, I've talked about this at length on this channel, but Jackie Love is not the player that he was when he first entered the league. I think he rightfully gained the reputation of being the most volatile AD carry in the world, the kind of guy that would go in, you know, 1v9 and just try try to make a play happen, try to kill 2, and then hope his team could win the 4v3 from that point onwards because he's going to die in return. And, you know, that worked for him for a while. It won him a world championship, so I certainly can't criticize him too much for that. But I think he realized he needed to shore up a lot of the more unnecessary deaths that he ended up having throughout that era. And honestly, over the last like 2.5 years, he's been a really consistently good AD carry that doesn't really make a lot of those weird mistakes that you would typically associate with JackeyLove. I think honestly, he's just turned into a super consistent ADC that has the same kind of mechanical high that JackeyLove has always had, but now is really adept at playing these more in-structure type of team comps. And so I really love JackeyLove. I've said this multiple times. I honestly don't really get why people aren't considering him a top 3 to 5 AD carry in the world. I think he has done nothing but be that for the past couple of years, and I get that top esports hasn't always lived up to that expectation, but like this guy's unbelievable. He has done everything he needed to do to kind of prove himself to be one of the best ADCs, and he continues to do that, even with Xiaoya being good on the other side. Kanavi was definitely more of the obvious carry, I would say, especially in the back half here on the Vi, on the Nidalee in game number 3. He was the one to really control the mid games and kind of separate TES. I was really high on Kanavi coming into the year. I thought he was going to have an MVP caliber season. I still think he can have that. This was a good performance. I'm certainly not trying to downplay how well he played here. I just think it's maybe not been as like exceptional as I thought it was going to be. I thought they were going to play for him a lot more in the early game. That's not necessarily how they have ended up really using their resources, but you know, Cream was fine. 369 was fine. Like these players were good enough for you to be able to win with. I think JackeyLove and Kanavi definitely stood out, but Crisp, not exactly the crispest series from him. We've kind of run into this a lot for Crisp, where it's just like the little things that he doesn't do particularly well. The big plays, he has like an absolute lock on those. He has like some of the flashiest, best big plays in the entire world. He is one of the most creative supports in the entire world. We've talked about this. He won a world championship because he was able to do that, but it's the little things that he has always really struggled at, and he continues to really struggle at that. He gets caught out randomly a lot of times in the support position, and it really does hurt his team. He just needs to clean those things up because he doesn't really have to be the star on top esports. He hasn't needed to be the star on his teams in a while, and it's just really funny. Typically speaking, though, every time he struggles in the regular season, he does phenomenal in the best of 5s in terms of the playoffs, and so we'll see if that ends up translating for top esports, but at 2-1, they will be advancing. Then for LGD, it's going to be a pretty quick conversation, I would say, because, again, the narrative around this team is just so obvious at this point, where it's like, they've got good hands, they are decent players individually, specifically players like Climber. He has a really good early game throughout most of this series. He generally has had really good early games throughout a lot of this winter split. Sorry, I don't know why I blanked on that. Throughout a lot of this winter split up until this point, Xiaoya and YCX, I think, actually played really well throughout a lot of this series, generated quite a bit of advantages. Xiaoya was definitely the best player on LGD, which is good because he's kind of been bad for this team at the start of this split, but it's always something in the mid to late game that just gets this team completely out of sorts, like over chasing Cream and just not really putting themselves in a position to be able to capitalize on advantages that they do generate in the early game. Like their macro is just horrendous, and that's kind of what you can expect from a mostly all-rookie team, but it's still a bit frustrating to watch. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Xiao Qinghua in the mid lane. Just a really bad Ryze game in game number 3. We've seen Ryze be super valuable throughout this week, and a lot of people are like, Ryze is super bait, Ryze is not a good champion. I think that could be true if you're bad. Like, I think the good mid laners will make Ryze look good. We've seen what Doenby can do with it throughout the week, but yeah, if you're Xiao Qinghua and you're going into top esports and you need to be able to use that like big ultimate to create macro advantages with your resources, then yeah, maybe it's not necessarily the pick to go for. I think the frustrating part is he did have so many resources throughout this series. They did put a lot of time and effort into trying to get him ahead, and he was just really bad in the back half of these games, really cost LGD a lot of pressure, and I think they probably win game 3 if he's like even remotely competent on the Ryze. He's just not really able to do that. So not a great series for Xiao Qinghua, but again, the mechanics are coming through. This guy is really good at getting resources. He's just not the most consistent at being able to do anything with them. Climber's been good in the early game. Xiaoya, like I said, was really good this series. YCX, I think, has been better than I expected. Saucy's been fine on the top side. Like, there are some things to take away here for LGD. I just don't know how many of them are translatable to actually winning games. It's all well and good to be able to generate leads, but if you can't close games out, it doesn't matter how big your lead is, and it doesn't even really matter how good the enemy team is that you're facing. Like, this is the kind of team that I think could lose to basically anybody in the LPL just because they don't really understand what they're doing in the back half of games, and that's just always going to be a bit of an anchor, a weight that's kind of bringing and dragging them down. They're going to have to get better in that stage of the game if they want to be relevant this year, but at least they have some sort of base to build off of that I think, you know, a team like WE that would be below them in the power rankings, they just don't have that. For top esports, though, on the other side, nice win. Like, it's not the most unbelievable win in the world. Like, you're still kind of waiting to see what this team is going to do in the playoffs itself. Like, they're going to be going in as the number 2 seed because they did lose to Anyone's Legend, who will be going in as the 1 seed from Group A, but that just gives Top Esports more experience to be able to play some games if they are going to be able to succeed. I still think this can be a top 2 team in the LPL if things go right. Again, that entire section from like 2 to 7, even 1 to 7, with Bilibili losing earlier this week, is just wide open at the current moment in the LPL, and Top Esports has more than enough talent if they can clean up the mistakes to be able to prove that they deserve to be in that conversation. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Weeks 4 and 5 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the final standings here for the LPL at the end of the regular season. We now know which 8 teams will be eliminated to kick off the winter split, whose splits will be done. Of course, the bottom 2 teams in each group, and of course, the top 2 teams in each group, the 8 teams that will be qualifying for the playoffs. The top seeds obviously are going in as the upper seeds. They're automatically slotted into winner's bracket, whereas the number 2 seeds from each group are automatically slotted into loser's bracket, lower bracket, if you will, and they will only have 1 life to continue their playoff journey on. There still is a lot to play for here in the LPL with first stand on the line, but we can quickly talk about how these groups shook out. Group A was a little bit surprising to me. AL, beating Top Esports. We kind of knew that AL was going to be moving forward after that victory before the Lunar New Year break, but it's still good to see these 2 teams come out. LGD Gaming and Weibo, also very similar. I think they ended in the order we anticipated. Group C is definitely the shocking one. ThunderTalk coming out as the number 1 seed from Group C is just about as far away from what anybody expected as you could possibly get. Even I was not expecting like ThunderTalk to be relevant. I thought they were going to be the worst team in this group. They are far from that. They are the best team in this group, at least in terms of current form, with their win over Bilibili, who is still making it out, but certainly has more question marks now than they did before the Lunar New Year break. And then Ninjas and Pyjamas and Invictus kind of rounding out, again, the 2 teams we expected to get out, even if they're not exactly in the order we thought they were going to be. So for the most part, I would say the 8 teams we anticipated, with the exception of ThunderTalk kind of being the big surprise to be able to make the playoffs. But now we're going to transition into the playoff bracket itself. As you can see up on the screen, those top 4 teams that won their group, they get that extra life. They get to go into round 2, they get to go into winner's bracket and kind of go from there, whereas the losers are on the lower bracket. They do not have that extra life to take care of. So we'll quickly preview the 4 series that we ended up getting. We'll start with the lower bracket because those series are going to be happening first. The first one is obviously Bilibili Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming. For this to be an elimination series and top 8 is actually insane. One of these teams will be done after this best of 5, and unfortunately for Weibo, I think it's probably going to be them. Bilibili, I still expect to be one of the best teams in the league, if not still the favorites to win the LPL, to go on a rampage and just go undefeated through this entire bracket and just kind of make their way to the finals. I think that that's definitely still a possibility, and unfortunately that means Weibo, I think, is going to be the team eliminated here. Definitely not the circumstance that they wanted, but unfortunately probably the circumstance they run into. And again, very similar here, Top Esports taking on Invictus Gaming. Also one of these teams is going to be eliminated, and once again, I think it's unfortunately going to be Invictus Gaming. I think Top Esports is the better team, although I'm not quite as sold on that. I think Bilibili is a big favorite over Weibo, and they are definitely kind of the favorites to win that one, but this one's more up in the air for me. I would expect Top Esports to be the better of these 2 teams. I think that they have shown more so far in the regular season. IG has not looked bad, but I don't think they've looked great either, and even if Top Esports hasn't been super consistent, that loss to AL is definitely kind of concerning me. I still think that they have enough firepower to be able to overcome this, so I would expect Bilibili and Top Esports to be the 2 teams moving on from that lower side of the bracket, and that means I think Weibo Gaming and Invictus are going to get 7th and 8th respectively, which is just kind of insane considering the circumstance, but that's what happens when you finish 2nd in your group here in the regular season. So let's transition to the upper bracket, quickly talk about those matchups. ThunderTalk taking on LGD Gaming. If ThunderTalk is able to pull off this upset, that is unreal. They beat JDG in Demacia Cup, and so I think there are going to be people that are kind of campaigning for them to be favorites in this series, but they're not favorites. If they take, this series at all, if they're competitive in this series, it's going to prove that they are as legit as they could possibly get, that this regular season performance is not a fluke, and that they should be considered amongst the top 2 or 3 teams in the LPL, because honestly, that's the kind of performances that they put on the Rift. It's just not anticipated for me. I think JDG is going to be able to handle this handily, or at least I would expect that to be the case. And then the very interesting matchup of Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Anyone's Legend. I really like the matchup between these two teams. I think Doanby versus Shanks is a very intriguing mid lane matchup. I'm really excited to see what happens with like Kale versus PP God. I think this is one of the more interesting, if not the most interesting, of the series that we got like draw-wise in, I guess, the quote-unquote first round, in winner's bracket first round. I'm going to slightly favor AL here. I just think they're in better form. I think this team has proven that, you know, Tarzan's kind of a game breaker, and I think Tarzan is just a better jungler than Aki, and I think that, to me, is kind of the separator here. But if Doanby pops off, if he's just in incredible form and can capitalize on Fearless kind of still being there, like, you know, he's kind of the king of Fearless in terms of what we've seen so far in the winter split, then I think that is going to be ginormous for Ninjas in Pyjamas. This is the closest, in my opinion, of these series. I think Top Esports and Invictus is also really close, but I would slightly favor Anyone's Legend. So I would have JD Gaming and AL moving on to winners finals, and I would have Thunder Talk and Ninjas in Pyjamas moving down to take on Bilibili and Top Esports respectively. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those opinions down in the comment section below. I'm always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions, but let's go ahead and wrap things up with my player of the week and my dud of the week here for weeks 4 and 5. Player of the week should be no surprise. This was a super easy decision. It's going to go to Doanby, the mid laner for Ninjas in Pyjamas. He just was exceptional across both of the series that we covered in today's video. The Rise in particular was dominant in both of his performances. He took over that game number 2, almost got player of the series on his own for that game number 2, and then was just as good on it in game number 3, even was pulling out picks like the Pantheon, the Aurora in both series looked very good across this week. Doanby just looks excellent in this current format, in this current, like, you know, fearless draft style situation, in the current meta where I think you can play a lot of weird things in the mid lane. I think Doanby is just in a really great spot to be able to skirmish and take advantage of the new map. So credit to Ninjas in Pyjamas. They've looked excellent, and Doanby has really popped back into pro play looking as good as he possibly could. And then my honorable mentions this week, Angel, the mid laner for LGD Gaming. He dominated that series that they played, and I know it wasn't like as consequential of a series, and LNG had a lot of problems, but like this was one of the more dominant performances we saw all week. He definitely deserved an honorable mention for player of the week. And then Beishuan, how do I not give this to Beishuan? Like, he beat Bilibili Gaming. He was the best player on the Rift against BLG as Thunder Talk's jungler. He's an honorable mention for player of the week. That's a ridiculous outcome. You know, Starry is definitely another player that I considered as an honorable mention here, but I ended up landing on these 3. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Shadow, the jungler for FPX. He gets inserted into the lineup and then just doesn't really get to do all that much. Again, unfortunately, he had the distinction of playing jungle twice this week and losing both series very handily, which means that he didn't necessarily have a very good look. I hope that he can grow and evolve, maybe get more time practicing and scrimming with this team and maybe get better chemistry with them, but right now, it was not a good first week starting for Shadow, even if I expected him to be an upgrade for FPX. So Shadow's going to be my dud of the week, and Doanby is going to be my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the LPL playoffs, you know, series by series. We might not be doing it, you know, quite every single day, as the format would indicate. We might be combining a couple of the series at the start of the playoffs, but we definitely will be covering every single series on this channel throughout the entirety of the playoffs, and First Stand is right around the corner, so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe. Of course, we also are covering the LTA playoffs right now, the cross conference, the LEC playoffs, the LCK playoffs. Everything's going on right now, and again, a big international tournament right around the corner. If you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all